So I'm delighted to be here to celebrate the Slovenian translation of my book. Cambridge University Press, it turns out, says that they're printing only 150 copies altogether. So I won't make a lot of royalties, but it might be a collector's item soon, is what I'm thinking. So with that view. But I'm looking forward to seeing my own copy soon.
Professor Wendt himself had been marked as one of the most influential authors in international relations as science in the last 20 years. That was in around 2014. So basically, we are talking to maybe celebrity or an institution in our science. How such excellent research work in our field, in social sciences or in IR, comes about. Okay, so what does it take to do that? So, Professor Wendt, from my side, I would like to pose the first question for you. And that is basically, what drives your research curiosity? We see that, already the 99 book, or rather the article from 92, on anarchy is what states make of it, kind of started a conversation with the mainstream IR theories, and was looking at the margin of science or theories. And then up to today, you are very much moving towards the margins or even beyond of social sciences. So what actually drives this curiosity?
2 years right after I finished the book, so we're talking 1999, 2000, in those 2 years, all three of the projects that I have worked on since the 99 book, and which I'm still working on in different degrees, all three of those projects, the seeds of those projects were laid in those 2 years right after that book was finished. So somehow finishing the book kind of released all these three crazy ideas, which you'll see in a second. And that's what I've been doing ever since. The entire research agenda in the subsequent 35 years is in that 87 article. And another way to put the agent structure problem, really, it's a problem of part and whole. How do the parts fit together to make a whole? And I've always been a holist, wanting to defend a holistic perspective on whatever it is we're doing in social science, as opposed to a more individualistic one, which is kind of the dominant orthodoxy, certainly in the United States. So I've been kind of pushing against the kind of mainstream in that respect. So that's the one big continuity in my career, I would say, intellectually, is the continuity of holism. I'm trying to justify holism, a holistic view of the agent structure problem or the part-whole relationship. So in a way, you could say, all my writing, I've been writing the same article or the same book over and over again, just in somewhat different ways. We're trying to figure out how to get it right. Okay, so and I had a narrative about my own dissertation, that the dissertation was really about me. So it was a kind of a narcissistic narrative. But setting that aside, and I guess just to give you the backstory here, as a kid, my dad was an academic, an immigrant, German immigrant, psychology professor, trying to get established. And so as a kid, we moved around constantly. I went to 9 different schools in 3 countries in 12 years before college. It was a very unstable existence, not a bad existence. We traveled a lot, but I was never able to get deeply integrated in any of the communities we moved to. And so I would we'd move someplace, I'd make a few friends after the first year, and then we move, and we have to start all over again. So this was on over and over and over again. And so I always had the feeling as a kid, and it was very conscious by the time I was a teenager, that I was an outsider looking in. I was never really part of the in-group. I wasn't on the out-group necessarily, but I wasn't in the in-group, certainly. And so I think that prepared me, it prepared me for isolation, the isolation of academic work. But it also prepared me to kind of do my own thing in terms of my interests, because I didn't have a lot of people to do them with. And so I just did my own thing. But it also left me with, I think, a lifelong desire to fit into a community, to find a community. And that's the agent structure problem in a sense, which is, how does the agent fit into the structure? And how does the part fit into the whole? And so it's how to fit me into the structure. And so I literally said to Mike Barnett that my dissertation was really an attempt to do that. And in a way, you could look at everything since then, 30 some years, as an intellectualization of this childhood struggle to become a member of a community. Okay. And I've talked to other people in my generation anyway, theorists especially, about this kind of idea that one's work can be a reflection of one's life. And I've heard this many times in different forms. I think that especially theorists are like this, but maybe not only, maybe that's just a selection bias on my part. But I think many of us, and I would love to hear other stories actually, so I don't think I'm the only one who's like this, but in any event, I think it's something that's more common, and it's something you can't really choose or control, right? It just happens to you, okay? I would treat it as hypothesis generation is kind of a nice way to put it, but it's speculation. I like work that is relatively unconstrained by facts, so I can kind of just imagine what's going on. So it's more fun that way. Second thing that I think ties these together, I've always been attracted to anomalies, things that are different, things that don't fit in, right? I like topics, I've always liked topics that are a bit dangerous, which means sort of ignored by the mainstream. And topics where there may not be any literature at all, or very little literature to work with to begin with. And you sort of have to just do it, make it up as I go along. And I especially like topics here where I don't know the answer totally going in, or I know the answer, I just don't know how to get there. And so there's some kind of mystery for me that I have to unravel as I write. If I know the whole process from front to back, there's no point writing it down. And actually, Peter Kassenstein, one of my few living mentors, wonderful mentor, recently characterized my work and the quantum book in particular, but I think it's all my work. You ever see the movie Free Solo, about rock climbing with no gear and no anything? Hardly anybody does it because it's so dangerous. Well, there's some great video from that movie. There's a movie called Free Solo, which I imagine myself there on the rock face without any sort of holding me there. And then the other metaphor that comes to mind is, I don't know if you ever read the book Into the Wild, about this wealthy 20-something who goes off into the wilds of Alaska by himself and he ends up dying, right? It's just kind of grim. But I like the idea that he wanted to go someplace where there were no paths, that there was just an open field and he could do what he wanted to do. So there's a taste for adventure there that I like, although only in my intellectual life. I think it's very important as a political scientist that for me, my work, whatever I'm working on, has to be normatively interesting. It has to matter whether it's right or not. If it doesn't matter from a political standpoint, then maybe somebody else should do it, but I'm just not interested. So the politics of it is really important. And we often forget that, I think, as social scientists or as political scientists. We just kind of assume that we're all doing politics. Well, maybe we're not. And so I think, remember, our PhDs are in political science, not in science, right? So you got to keep that political piece of your project alive.
Welcome, Stefano. You're kind of a home person almost, because you're a research, but nevertheless, we also warmly welcome you.
Let me start perhaps just by saying how important Alexandra Wendt's work was for myself. I mean, I was writing my PhD when he had just finished and came out with his second article, and many things just fell into place. Now he's unhappy about how they fell into place at the time, but it was very helpful at the time for me, for sure. And it was also an incredibly important meeting point for references, for focusing around a particular debate. So when we organized a special issue for the Journal of International Relations and Development, it was following up well, basically very young colleagues in the region and in Central Eastern Europe who tried to come together and discuss and think through this rather heavy work. And my poor students still have to read it every year. It's part of the reading list in which they have to write a book review, and they have given 1 week in Uppsala for doing so. So they still know it. So I mean, it's difficult to underestimate actually the impact this particular book had. And how, in a sense, I understand that one wants to move obviously forward, and that you had a sense of relief when it was finally done. But for us, it was also a starting point, not a starting point, but because it started earlier. Right. But it was a very important focal point. And still, many of my students still think that the first part is the better way to get philosophy of science than most of the introductions they get later in the methodology courses. So in your presentation, you say that in the autobiographic component, that you were always one who longed for fitting in. Mm-hmm. But then in your intellectual statement, you say that you look for things that don't fit in.
Right.
So, and literally you use that twice. So basically the strategy is to do something that doesn't fit in order to fit in a community. But that's
what my therapist says.
That only works, that will only work if the community turns to you rather than you fitting the community. Community needs to fit you.
That's right.
But that doesn't work, right? So what does
that usually? Well, I kind of worked with constructivism. It wasn't intentional. I mean, everyone was as surprised about the success of my early career as I was, because there was no coming out of grad school thinking that's what was going to happen. So, but anyway, I'm sorry, I kind of cut you off. So,
no, but it's just, I mean, it is a question of personal experience. So it works back to the autobiographic starting point from which you came. So how does one deal with the fact that one wants to fit in yet by doing things that don't? How is I mean, there will be compromises, there will be ways of dealing with this, but there will be also quite painful moments when it probably doesn't work, right?
Oh yeah, that's in fact the most painful moment I had in my entire career was over exactly this issue. And it was right after this book came out at ISA, and there was an exchange between Rick Ashley and I in front of 250 people, and it was awful. I mean, it was the worst experience I ever had in my career, and it was a clear sign that I was clearly being gatekeeped against the kind of critical post-structural kind of perspective. And I understand what Ashley was saying now better than I did then. Actually, I don't think I understood fully what he was saying, and I appreciate his point much better now. So, but I mean, that fitting in, not fitting in, or looking for things that don't fit in order to fit in, that's the tragedy of my career in a sense. Maybe you could think of it that way if you're joking about it. But no, that's a very interesting way to put it. And I think that is the strategy. But I also think, and I guess I didn't say this in my remarks about the kinds of projects I choose, but I'm interested in high risk, high payoff projects. That's how my advisor described my dissertation. I asked him very early on, but Duval, should I do this dissertation? It looks kind of crazy that other dissertations aren't like this. And he said, well, it's high risk, high payoff, and just got to accept that. And I got lucky, and so it was, it worked out. But it could have gone badly. And I was very lucky because I literally finished the dissertation only a couple months before the Berlin Wall came down at the end of the Cold War. And so that was a huge change in the real world, and nobody predicted that. Nobody expected that to happen. The realists, no one expected it to happen, except a couple of sociologists apparently. And Bruce Russett claimed after the fact that he predicted. But anyway, I think that was a huge opening up that kind of made people receptive to new ways of thinking. Clearly, we needed to start thinking differently about world politics, and especially once the Soviet Union collapsed, it really became a very different world in that sense. And that was very helpful to not only constructivism, but all kinds of critical thinking and the huge flowering of IR theory that we see today, which is such an interesting field because there's so many different kinds of things going on in our field. It's a complete opposite of some other areas in political science, and that makes it really interesting.
Thank you very much. We also have another question coming up.
Well, that's a big question. It's a very good question. It's a hard question. I guess, and I get this question. In fact, I wrestle with this question a lot myself. And I would say it depends on what level we're talking about. Empirically, there's now a very extensive literature in mathematical psychology that shows, I think without a doubt, that probably all the famous Kahneman and Tversky anomalies in psychological decision-making and sort of all the irrationalities in human cognition and everything that psychologists have documented the past 40 or 50 years, they apparently all can be explained if you use a quantum formalism instead of the standard rational choice model as kind of the baseline. So the added value there is that we explain a whole bunch of apparently psychological anomalies that no one has had an explanation for before, especially not a comprehensive explanation. So I would say it's one of the biggest, most massive resolution of anomalies that we've seen in social science in a long time, if not ever. So I think that's a very significant empirical contribution. Theoretically and philosophically, I think if you take a quantum worldview seriously, and if that's your starting point for thinking about human beings and how we connect to each other through quantum minds, and the quantum mind hypothesis, of course, is very controversial, but assuming it's true, and I do assume it's true, then it leads to a very different conceptualization of part-whole relationships, for one thing, because it's completely holistic, as opposed to individualistic. So I think, and that affects your politics, and it affects the way you do the science and think about the science, but I would say it also affects the politics, because it's much more of a top-down, well, it's top-down, but it's bottom-up at the same time. It's holographic and so on. So I mean, it's obviously gets more complicated, but I mean, and I think when you start seeing entanglement instead of separate countries or separate people, then I think that affects the way you understand their behavior and, of course, the political implications.
So my question is sort of an elaboration of what Vasya already asked. I'm also very interested in this part of your research of quantum physics connected to social sciences. So basically, for someone who has always been awful at physics, my question is two-part. First, what are your thoughts on the existence of free will? And I think I can expect what you will say then. And then also, what does this mean for international relations, especially for research in international relations? And have you come up with any interesting real-life example or historical examples where the result of analysis has been different than maybe in the mainstream?
Well, those are good questions. On the free will issue, there's been a long-standing debate within quantum theory about free will and does it support free will or not. Many people say, well, in quantum theory, it's probabilistic, it's random, and therefore you can get free will. And the critics say, no, free will is not random. Free will can't be probabilistic. It's something different than that. So it's a controversy within the theory itself for a long time, within the interpretation of the theory. Lately, there's been a lot of work done on this specific issue, and I think a lot of it is supporting the idea of free will. And so that's where I'm definitely at too. So for me, this is a way to salvage some kind of idea of agency. I mean, if you think about standard social science, the perfect social scientific model would have no error term. And what does that mean? It means that the result was deterministic, which means there's no agency, there's no free will. So social science is all about eliminating agency and squeezing the agency out of the picture until all you have is structure and determination. So free will kind of gives you that agency, and it's sort of irreducible and you can't escape it. So in terms of the applications to IR, well, there haven't been many that are empirical. And part of the problem, I think, is a data problem or a scientific problem, which is that the way that these effects, these quantum effects show up empirically is really most visible only if you're doing public opinion. You have lots and lots of data points, and you can look at human cognition at the individual level. And most of IR scholarship, of course, is not at the individual level, it's at the level of states or IOs, and see what you can do. I think there's lots of things that you can do here. It's a wide open field. It's not easy to publish, certainly, but it is something that if you're young, you can be have an early first mover advantage. I mean, it's just because it is a wide open area without a lot of established norms and so on. So we don't have a lot of examples, but what I am starting to see are, well, there's a growing literature on quantum theory and kind of normative political theory in IR, which has its own kind of issues, and well, not issues. I mean, there's a lot going on there, which is quite interesting. And then when I'm getting a lot of emails from people and projects people are working on, what they're doing is tweaking or trying to tweak existing models, or usually rational choice models, and substituting in quantum assumptions and see what kind of differences you get, either conceptually or maybe empirically. And I think that's exactly the right strategy. You know, basically take the existing models that are well formalized, they're very mathematical, it's all coming from economics, and you show the difference that a quantum approach makes in either conceptually or not.
The first is that quantum has become quite fashionable. So that you were the odd one out, and you're still the odd one out in one particular way. But there are many people who are happy jumping on it, and yet they're happy jumping on it in ways in which you might not necessarily like it. Namely, whereas you basically push us to take science very seriously, many use it as an excuse not to take science seriously. So it's basically almost joining the, how can I say, the debate before we had methodological debates in a kind of, yes, holistic, but a little bit new agey way, which reminds me of my good old youth in the 60s, 80s, early 70s kind of understanding. So how would you react to that particular way of receiving, of thinking about quantum, which might, in one hand, it should be welcome, but it might actually undermine part of the project, the very project that you had been thinking about when you launched it?
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I guess I hadn't noticed that it was fashionable. I've noticed that a lot of people don't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Even people that should be looking at it, I think, are just reluctant. Political psychologists, for example, they should be all over this because it's mathematical psychology. And I talk to my colleagues, they're just like terrified of looking at it. So maybe it's more fashionable in Europe than it is in America, like many things are. So, you know, in that sense, maybe there's hope for the future. You know, I think a lot of people, some people are on the more scientific or kind of more comfortable with the scientific. Even I'm not doing the mathematical stuff myself, obviously, or empirical. So I'm only scientific in kind of the meta sense. You know, I have a lot of correspondence, you know, around different places that are interested in that side. But there is kind of the more the neo-materialists, and then what they've become. Some of them have gone on to this kind of quantum stuff, and for them it's more of a metaphor. And you know, I guess the metaphors are fine as long as you're using them properly and everything else. I don't have a problem with metaphor. I don't know why you would want to use a metaphor if you actually can have the truth in some way. So I'm a realist in that sense, but I think it's all to the good. And even people who want to only use it as a metaphor often have really good insights, obviously, into the way quantum might inflect or help shape our understanding of social life. So whether you believe it or don't believe it, as long as you use it, that's all I care about. The ones who are reluctant to take the realist route and want to limit this to a metaphor, I guess I would say that a better solution is to rethink what we mean by science. I mean, the idea that science equals classical science, that's the problem. And I think the metaphor view reinforces that perspective. It says, yes, we concede science to this classical world. So they're implicitly taking a classical worldview when it comes to matters of ontology. Now, maybe ontology doesn't matter very much, and then it's okay. But still, I think there is a danger in the metaphor route of conceding too much to the old Newtonian worldview that's clearly mistaken, if you ask me. So anyway, that's just my opinion.
What you call the error term, or that there would be only determination if it would be only the whole, and there's a structure and so on. And that free will is connected to the idea of agency. And that agency is basically introducing the contingency into the system, or the kind of, the parts which are not necessarily just deterministic, as you called it. I was wondering whether we need really to
Sorry.
No problem. Whether we need really to tie so closely the idea of contingency or change to the idea of agency, because that reinforces basically an old prejudice about, well, the individual being the hero in the system. I'm not excluding this kind of change, of course. But would it not be possible simply to say that nothing is in a closed system, and therefore everything evolves in an open and to some extent always indeterminate, or to some extent indeterminate manner, be it structure, or indeed be it the agent him or herself?
Well, I guess it might depend on what you mean by determinism. I guess as I think about the classical mechanical, you think about Newton's system. I don't know classical physics very well, but determinism is, you know, it seems to rule out any kind of purposive agency that's that involves contingency. So, but I take your point that I wouldn't want to link agency too much to contingency, because I'm not quite sure what contingency means. I see agency being connected to purposiveness or purposefulness, to teleology at the individual level, so to speak. And that, I think, is what quantum helps us introduce. Free will introduces that. And I think it does create some contingency in the system. But most people, most of the time, obey the rules, and there's not a whole lot of contingency. So I'm not sure, but I should stop there and let you kind of come back, because I'm not sure if I'm tracking with what you're saying.
No, I think it's fine. But it is basically the understanding that a structural reproduction doesn't need to be closed, right? And what makes it non-closed? If we fall back on agency being the one that makes it not closed, then we are basically falling back on a strong agential understanding of any change, which might or might not be needed. I mean, this is just for.
I see.
Because in the past you gave to the holistic structure or to the intersubjective structures actually some leverage for change. There was not necessary. It was not. Yes, of course, it always passes via agency in some sense, but it's not necessarily connected to the individual purposeness. So there, if I understand you correctly, there would be a dual purposiveness. The one is in the system or in the whole, and the other one would be for the agent at the same time.
Yeah, and I think actually in the World State paper, that's even explicit toward the end. I talk about the system acquiring intentionality and agency, although that's kind of an extreme example. But I remember now what your point about why is the system closed or not closed? And I think that's an important, I guess I would respond, why would the system not be closed if it's a classical system? We may not be able to understand how it works and be able to predict it because it might be chaotic, for example, or too complex. But complexity is not quantum. That's deterministic still in the end, in the sort of ontological sense. So if we're going to appeal to a system not being closed, I agree, all systems are open in real world. And a lot of them are open to natural material inputs that are things that, you know, from my perspective, I don't pay much attention to. But it's also open in the sense of agency. And I favor a strong agency, a strongly agentic perspective, even though I'm all about the whole. I think the whole is in the parts. I mean, that's what's nice about the quantum view, because it gives you this holographic picture where it's not a parts and a whole. The whole is in the parts, and the parts don't even exist apart from the whole. And so it's very much integrated. It's an entanglement issue.
Here.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
Thank you for being here. I have a question on your world state theory. So basically today conflict is increasingly driven by the resource scarcity. And I'm basically interested in how your theory solves this issue, because I think in your article, it is not much written about it. Thank you.
No, that's good. I think, you know, I guess I'm not convinced that a lot of the conflict in the world today, the violent conflict, is driven by resource scarcity. If you think about the war in Ukraine, that's about the struggle for recognition, which is sort of directly addressed in the World State paper. Lots of other conflicts are just old-fashioned. Now, certainly there are regions of the world where resources are extremely problematic, and there'll be groups that fight over them. But even in the Sahel, you know, against the Islamic State, is that resource scarcity, or is that ideology, religion, ethnicity, maybe some resource scarcity thrown in? So I'm not trying to minimize the importance of climate change, certainly. I'm just, of course, I haven't studied this area, so maybe I'm just naively being skeptical. But it is true that in the World State article, I don't address resource scarcity per se. My view of it, though, would be that resource scarcity is to some extent socially constructed.
So the way you explained your choice of research topics you've been working on since the book was out. It sounded as if this choice was, quite coincidental. But still, if we look at the three research topics, the world state, UFOs, and quantum, it seems to me, but maybe it's good that we didn't write this down in the introductory study. So
say it first and then I'll decide.
Yeah. So it seems to me as if these are in a way attempts to respond to some of the criticisms, as well as to try to push some of the arguments towards their limits. So, for example, the world state, it sounds as a response to those who would say that your book was not revolutionary enough, especially the second part of the book. Mm-hmm. And then quantum, it's the response to materialists. It shows that it's not just the world of IR that is not fixed, but the world as such. It shows that the world as such perhaps is not fixed. And UFOs, this one is very interesting to me. So UFOs are a kind of known, unknown known. So they exist, they are material, but they are still pre-social. There's no existing social experience with engaging with UFOs. So in a way they show, or they might be used as a test case to see how social experience emerges, how it is being developed, and how it impacts understanding of a certain thing, which is material, but still pre-social, yet unknown. Thanks.
Wow, that's your last comment. Actually, that's a grad student dissertation. It's like a natural experiment in a way that we're kind of in the midst of, if these things are actually real and all that kind of thing. So, but no, I had never thought about these three projects that way before. So that's perfect. I mean, it's I would have written my talk differently if I had talked to you beforehand. So I would. So I think in each case too, I think you pinpointed exactly right what the connection is, and especially on the UFO and the pre-social, since I'm working on that right now, that's especially interesting. So no, that's excellent. So thank you. That's really interesting. Is there any problem on my end, or am I okay?
No, I think it's on there.
Okay. I think personally, as academics, I have the best job in the world. I mean, I love my job, and I think all of us as academics, or at least very privileged academics, have an incredibly good lifestyle. And I feel like we have a responsibility to say something that other people can't say, or they won't say, or they don't know how to say, but that makes a difference. And so when I talk to my graduate students and they ask me what should I do my dissertation on, and I say, well, don't fill any gaps. You don't think that what you're doing is gap filling or laying a brick in a wall. Think of it as mountain climbing, or getting in a canoe and heading off into Polynesia and trying to discover an island or something like that. That's what I did. So I think, there's a sense of, this is not just a job, right? This is a responsibility. And I think the part of the responsibility is to try to say bigger things than if you have the opportunity, and I've been lucky in my career. And so it's kind of paying it forward or something like that. I don't know how to say it.
How would you advise students or researchers who work in the margin of social sciences or IR? Because you kind of moved yourself towards towards the margin, yes, because you first were talking about non-mainstream theorizing, and then, moving towards issues that are in the margin of science. And now, if I hear you correctly, you say that high risk, high payoff projects, that's the one advice you have, right? Then you say discover islands and do mountain climbing with the metaphor. We understand this. And then you say external shocks also help to raise the value of your work. So would you add anything as a final advice?
Well, if you can find a way to engineer external shocks, that would be really helpful. But usually we can't do that ourselves, but it certainly helps once in a while. I would say in terms of the high risk, high payoff, I think that has to be, calibrated to the student and your strengths and weaknesses. And you got to think about what are you good at? What are you not so good at? And so on. I can't do math. So that eliminates a lot of social science for anything that I can do. And that may help struct my choices and so on. So I think especially graduate student advising has to be very individualized. And, Duvall's advice, I think we talked about this once, he and I, his philosophy of advising was, in effect, to try to help grad students help grad students figure out what their own best idea is, their own most creative, most provocative idea, and then help them grow that idea. So don't produce clones. Don't try to produce, just kind of cogs in a machine. You're growing each. It's like a gardening versus a carpenter model of child rearing. Some people think of child rearing as you're like a carpenter and you're trying to make kids a certain way. And then there's the gardening model. And I think graduate advising is very much like gardening. It has to be individualized, has to be calibrated to the student. But I would say in terms of if you're at the margins, at Minnesota, where I did my PhD, I would say we were in the semi-periphery there. And that still is a semi-periphery in a way. And that gives there's some advantages to being in the semi-periphery. Partly you have more freedom to do what you want to do because the expectations of the core is not so oppressive in a way. And so we had a lot more flexibility at Minnesota. And I would say, though, if you're at the margin, quantum is perfect for you because it's also at the margin, but it's an unbelievable system of thought that seems to explain incredible things in the world. And now you've got quantum biology coming on strong, quantum information, quantum computation. There's a quantum computation arms race between the United States and China. Quantum is gaining traction slowly. It's going to be hard work, but if you get in on it early on, then you become one of the people who, I think this is the future. So that I'm obviously being a bit of a proselytizer now, but I'll stop now. But I would say that it's a good bet. This is not a high risk bet, I would say, if you can figure out how to do it. That's the thing. You got to figure out how to do it.
I think this is a high point to wrap up today's event. I thank you sincerely in my own name, in the name of our community, also faculty, that you took the time, enlightened us with some of your even personal experience in your research career and with your work. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Stefano again for doing this very effective liaison and being obviously a dear friend to our community always. Thank you very much.
And if I could just say thank you all for coming and letting me, it's given me an opportunity to reflect on my career that I haven't really done in a lot of time, often ever. And so in that sense, it's been interesting for me as well. Plus, I've enjoyed talking and having your questions and that kind of thing. So thank you. All right.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sounds good. All right. Thank you. All right. See you later. Okay.
Thank you, Stefano. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah.